Night folds over an ancient sea, and in the hush between waves, an old rumor rises like breath from the water, the kind that refuses to become quiet history, and instead lingers as a question with its own tide. A question we keep naming Atlantis, even when we suspect it was never just a place at all, but a way of arranging knowledge that the ocean edited into silence, while leaving its outline for careful minds to trace. The earliest map of this rumor arrived through a philosopher who loved clarity more than spectacle, preserving a story of a ringed city laid out like a deliberate diagram, of canals as arteries and temples set inside circles, like thoughts inside thoughts. And even if his intent was parable, the details read like measurements, as if the architecture itself was a sentence the sea could not entirely erase, no matter how long it held its breath. Between those circles and channels, there lives a language that is older than any single tongue, a language of proportion and placement that leans on geometry, the way a singer leans on pitch, turning harbors into compasses and courts into calendars, so that the city becomes an instrument with the horizon as its scale. And even if the player is gone, the score lingers in stone for whoever knows how to listen. Water is the planet's patient editor, and when it rises, it turns libraries into reefs and laboratories into beds for fish. But it also leaves a ledger written in sandbars and drowned terraces, in drowned river mouths and silt-choked bays, a book with most pages missing, but with enough marginal notes to tempt a reader back, especially one who understands that absence can be a kind of presence in an archive as restless as the sea. In that briny ledger flickers the name of a metal. It gleamed like sunlight, caught in copper's deeper dream, Orichalcum, half poetry and half practice, until divers lifted red gold, ingots from the hold of a wreck, and chemists untangled the alloy, while historians argued over lineage. A moment that makes the myth feel less like vapor and more like a mirror misted by time, waiting for a sleeve to clear it gently. Beneath these scattered glints lies a pattern larger than any ship's cargo, a pattern of memory and forgetting that echoes in every culture's pulse, because texts burn, tools corrode, and languages shed their skins, but proportions travel quietly, embedded in alignments and ratios that resurface like motifs in music, resilient because they live in relation more than in objects, an inheritance without a signature that survives, even when names don't. At the end of the last ice age, shorelines retreated inland like armies in slow motion, and plains that once grew grass for mammoth now host cod and herring, turning campfires into reefs and footpaths into channels. A catastrophe so gradual that a single lifetime might only feel its edge, yet so relentless that entire ways of knowing drifted into deeper water, leaving myths as buoys for those who came after. Across that long melt, stories bloomed of floods and fires and nights that felt like the end of habit. And even where no empire stood in stone, there were networks of practice calendars, canals, courses of trade that vanished beneath new maps, so that the memory of a many-island world may have survived, not as coordinates, but as a silhouette, passed along by sailors and priests who learned to let truth travel under cover. If the core of that truth was the habit of binding sky to ground, then stones are its notebooks, and their pages remain open on windswept hills and in sun-baked valleys. The sentence is written as alignments to solstice and equinox, the punctuation set as sightlines to moonrise extremes, all of it calibrated with a patience that implies not only craft, but a covenant with slow cycles, the kind that measures in centuries instead of seasons. A philosopher's date sits uncomfortably near the last great climate stutter, and whether he misheard a priest or gilded a moral lesson, it points us toward a band of time when the sea moved fast enough to make coasts tremble. And in that band, survivors would have walked inland carrying seeds of practice, more than seeds of wheat, mapping new homes with old habits, turning temples into clocks again, even when the names for the months had changed. Every origin tale carries an ethic folded inside, and the island with rings warns against a mind intoxicated by its own control, against the glow that comes from mastery unmoored from measure, a caution sharper because it wears the clothes of elegance, reminding us that the same ratios that yield beauty can tip into imbalance if they stop listening to the context that birthed them. So the search becomes less a hunt for walls under silt and more a tuning of attention to signatures that recur, the fondness for certain angles, the reuse of a few favorite numbers across ships and sanctuaries, the love of resonant spaces that turn sound into balm, the marriage of water and stone in ways that bleed either into the other, hinting at a worldview that saw environment as partner rather than passive backdrop. Treat the legend as a mnemonic, and it becomes a compass, not pointing to a single harbor, but to a family of evidence scattered across continents. A kit of techniques disguised as myth waiting for patient hands to unpack. And in that patience, the question shifts from whether the island stood here or there to how its rumored knowledge moved and mutated, how it proved itself by surviving loss through evolution rather than by resisting it. When memory travels by proportion rather than by parchment, it can ride inside many cultures without stretching them, embedding itself in whatever stones they raise and whatever courses they sail, which is why fragments feel familiar without being identical, why a stare in one place answers a shadow in another, and why we should expect kinship without demanding lineage, if we want to read what the sea has not erased. The coast at night holds both danger and invitation, and standing there listening to swells break on dark rock, one can feel the nearness of something old and unfinished, a conversation that started when the first builders set two stones a certain distance apart and aimed them at the sunrise, confident that the sky would keep its appointment, a confidence we might borrow now as we begin to follow these quiet lines outward. Somewhere under the black water sleep the pieces that won't fit neatly, the stair that looks too regular, the wall that seems too straight, the hulk that carried alloys named in whispers. And somewhere inland their echoes wait in sunlit courtyards and shadowed chambers, steady in their refusal to turn into certainty just yet, inviting us to look closer and to let the question lead instead of the answer. The tide turns and the night exhales, and with that breath, the horizon widens just enough to suggest where to look next. Not at a single point on a map, but along the margins where sea and stone argue, where memory changes phase from liquid to solid and back again, a threshold where lost knowledge tends to pause, as if waiting for someone to ask the right kind of question and step quietly toward it. Begin with a measure hidden in the body and echoed in the sky, and architecture turns into choreography, because when ancient builders set out grids with a consistent step and anchored corners to stellar risings, they were inscribing rhythm on landscape, turning distance into tempo, and what repeats across widely separated places may be less diffusion than a convergence, on the same handful of elegant numbers that make space feel right. At the edge of the desert, a vast stone mountain built by hands aligned so closely to true north that even tiny errors feel deliberate, its base whispering to the circumference of the planet and its height flirting with circles in ways that stir endless debate. Yet what matters is not a single coincidence, but a habit of precision, a desire to braid human effort with terrestrial constants, as if to set shelter inside cosmic grammar. Geometry is the mother tongue of permanence, and for people who thought in shapes before they wrote in script, Triangles and circles became acts of devotion, making temples that read like theorems and courtyards that resolve into proofs when the sun writes their shadow in the afternoon. A literacy that survives calamity because the sentences are spatial and the grammar is the firmament, meaning that even ashes cannot burn ratios. Sound joined this language as a quiet ally, and certain chambers still hum at particular tones with a potency that can be measured, amplifying a single low note into a standing wave that brushes the skin like a hand, while niches and corridors lengthen echoes into pulses that slow breathing, turning ritual into physiology in a way that hints at a science of comfort built into stone, a technology that makes calm without a switch. Metals carried the same temper of insight into fire, and forges taught their keepers how to read stones from the earth's darker rooms, coaxing gleam from dull ore with sequences as precise as any hymn. And in the inventory of alloys that resulted sits a red gold with a mythic name, but a very practical sheen, its discovery in a silted hull, reminding us that what poetry preserves, practice can occasionally confirm with weight. On windy uplands of the north, circles of monoliths and banks of earth record lunar extremes with a patience that stretches across generations, their avenues and gaps arranged to greet movements so slow that no single life could learn the pattern unaided, an architecture of relay that points to a culture able to pass duty and knowledge like a baton, trusting that time itself would be their collaborator if they set the stones correctly. Under flagstones in old sanctuaries, water often moves in cut channels, not only to drain, but to partner, slipping beneath thresholds at places where load is greatest and vibrations are keenest, a subtle conversation between mass and flow that modern engineers can instrument but hardly claim, suggesting a memory of the land's own currents woven into plan, a kind of electrical and acoustic empathy before vocabulary existed to name it. Map the ground for faults and the quiet size of the earth, and lines appear that old tracks and towers often ride, a fact that tempts wild claims, but also invites a more modest conclusion, that traditional siting was sensitive to the body's response to place, to the comfort of dryness and the clarity of air, to the ease of footing and the resonance of stone, a composite sense tuned by long practice that a culture could teach without paper. Even ships seem to carry the signature of this mindset, their reconstructed dimensions tending toward the same ratios beloved in halls, as if the canon of proportion governed not only how a room sings, but how a hull moves through water. And this unity of design across domains looks less like imitation and more like expression of a few principles that traveled widely because they made everything a little better, whether floating or standing. Where archaeologists and acousticians cross thresholds together, old rooms yield new data, spectrograms blossoming with bands of color where chants once unfolded, decibel lines rising where the walls most insist on certain pitches, turning awe into numbers without stealing its soul. And those numbers echo across continents, like constellations repeat in different mythologies, kindred even when their names do not match. That polish of technique throws the hinted catastrophe into sharper relief, because a coastal civilization, optimized for particular tides and winds, risks breaking when the climate itself shifts the tuning, and a network bound by harbors and isthmuses can become a net that snags its own people when seas stride inland, compelling an inland migration that is as much an intellectual transport as it is a physical retreat. After such a shock, what survives most gracefully is what can fold small, and ratios fold smaller than scrolls do, travel easier than statues do, gossip better than formal doctrine does. And so the diaspora of techniques moves along caravan routes and atop high ridges, embedding itself in mountain sanctuaries and hill forts where the horizon is a ring not of sea, but of stone, waiting to marry new skies with old loves. All of which suggests that the fabled archive of Atlantis, if it ever existed in a single room, is now a library dispersed like stars in a galaxy, its catalog written in alignments and harmonies instead of titles, legible through repetition and recurrence rather than through author and date. A place we visit not by ship, but by learning to read the signatures that recur wherever humans listened hard to the sky. That is why the shore calls with such stubborn persistence, because at the boundary where maps edit themselves with salt, memory wears two faces at once, solid and fluid. A liminal line where a channel once used in festival can now be traced only by faint humps under tide, and where the next clue often lies just one storm away from being covered again, as if the sea itself were teasing patience into our methods. The urge to step beyond dry land sharpened with every recognition of this pattern, and the next phase of the search lives in cold water, among silt clouds and wandering currents, where instruments must replace eyes and constancy must replace luck, because whatever waits below will not offer a single revelation but a sequence of hints, each demanding another dive and another season of quiet work. Beneath the slap of waves against breakwater, the darkness opens into terraces and channels unseen from the surface, the kind of places where geometry could sleep for millennia without complaint, and where the first stone you touch may only be natural, and the second a coincidence, and the third the beginning of a sentence that no one has read aloud for a very long time, a sentence that wants more listeners. Between storms and seasons, the line between natural form and human intention thins and thickens like a living thing, and the only way to read it is to assemble evidence across sights and scales, to follow the way a favorite ratio walks from a bay to a hill to a hall, which is slow work by design, but the right kind of slowness for a mystery that has survived precisely because it cannot be rushed. The floor of the continental shelf is a museum without lights, its displays arranged by accident and edited by current. And yet when sonar hums over a drowned river mouth, the returning pulse paints straight edges and right angles in gray, rectangles that should not live where only sand should be. And even as caution whispers of pareidolia, the diver's heart knows that patterns are invitations as much as they are traps. Off a warm coast, a causeway-like scatter of stones steps into green-blue water at a stubborn angle, each block bearing the wear of waves like a sculptor's hand. And for decades, eyes have argued over whether skill or geology laid them there, an argument that matters less for certainty than for method, because good questions refine instruments, and refined instruments will eventually expose intention if it exists. Farther east, an underwater stair descends into darkness with a theatricality that stirs the mind. Tier upon tier of flat faces and sharp corners looming in the gloom. And again, the earth offers its plausible explanations, while the imagination offers its own. And in the space between, serious work proceeds. Measuring bedding planes, tracing fault lines, looking for tool marks where none may be, all to earn the right to wonder. North of these tropical puzzles lies a wide gray plain that once rang with hooves and voices, and now hides under, its hills rounded by silt, and its valleys filled by slow rivers that forgot their names. And at its edges, fishermen pull bones and timbers from their trawls, testimony from a country that never knew it would drown. A reminder that loss does not always come as a wall, but as a tide that requires many backward steps. At the outer shelf of a different ocean, a plateau pokes up like a memory. Volcanic islands perched on a fault seam, with scars that speak of sudden collapse. And on the way to the deep, A ridge shoals into waters that once were lower by enough to turn seamounts into sanctuaries, and banks into beaches. A world that could shelter fleets across storms, before warming made those refuges return to fish and foam. In a desert far from any wave, a vast set of arcs curls outward like the rings in a cross-section of a shell. And while geologists can unravel its making in terms of uplift and erosion, the eye that has been fed images of concentric harbors cannot help but map that description onto the sand. A cautionary tale about how memory hunts for likeness, and how method must insist on cause as well as resemblance, if it wants to stay honest. Closer to the old inland sea, entire districts once vibrant with commerce slid into the harbor with disasters slow and sudden, and centuries later, divers work by touch in mud-choked rooms, freeing statues of kings and queens coated with a skin of silt, reintroducing colonnades to sunshine piece by piece, proving that the sea does not obliterate. It obscures, and it will relent if offered patience and respect in trade. Beyond the reach of air breathers, mid-ocean ridges unroll like the backs of sleeping beasts, smoking at their spines like engines of the planet. A factory floor that builds and swallows crust with a patience that makes human time feel like weather. And the thought of foundations enduring, there is folly, because anything we built on those pulsing seams would return to magma as easily as a thought returns to silence. Legends speak of a plain ringed by mountains beyond a famous strait, a place of rivers and canals and fields measured out like a checkered cloth. And when Paleoshoreline maps overlay that strait with positions it held 12,000 years ago, the possibility of a complex coast with many islands emerges. Not a single capital, but a quilt. And quilts can be remembered as a single blanket if the storyteller values unity over detail. In the west of that same sea, ancient writers mention a people whose ships ran the rivers like threads, whose wealth depended on metal and marsh, and whose name fades and returns in textual echoes like a tide, an archaeological lure that leads to estuaries dense with promise and silt. And whether or not they are cousins to the legend, the discipline of looking for them polishes the lens through which we view the larger question. Old charts made when the world was still being argued into shape sometimes show bays with an accuracy that startles. Coastlines guessed more rightly than they should be by rights. And these anomalies have inspired tales of lost surveys and secret repositories. But even if those fables crumble, the idea that knowledge travels in busy holds and between hands, as often as in courts, reminds. Use that memory survives commerce as well as priesthood. In the present, robots swim in darkness with eyes that see by ping and pulse, stitching together mosaics of the floor that unfurl into maps more detailed than any captain dared dream, revealing terraces where rivers once ran and dunes petrified into rock, and sometimes lines that will not stop resembling walls until a diver puts a glove against them. And even then, the echo of the hope lives in the wrist. A core pulled from the floor, a slender cylinder of layered time, can hold surprises no camera finds. Pollen from a tree that does not grow near this coast, charcoal where fire should not be, shells out of place by the hundreds, each a clue that currents or humans disturbed what would otherwise settle neatly. A thumbprint in mud that sends teams back with better instruments and better questions for the next season. None of this amounts to proof in the courtroom sense. And that may be precisely why the pursuit endures, because a mystery that cannot be solved in a day teaches a different kind of attention, the habit of returning to the same square of sea in different weather, of accepting that one clear image must be earned by dozens of muddy ones, and of letting the rhythm of evidence teach the mind to breathe in patience. As the map of the sea floor clarifies, It becomes a palimpsest where older rivers can be traced under newer sands and drowned shores can be seen running, like ghost lines under the blue. And this deeper geography invites a kinder reading of the legend, one that understands how memory compresses and how landscapes can be remembered as archetypes when specifics scatter, a reading that sends us forward without requiring certainty. On any given day, waves still overwrite tracks made hours before, a reminder that whatever waits below is not indifferent but busy, a living eraser and editor that forces humility into any plan. And in that humility lies the hope that the next pass will catch a terrace in perfect light, or a straight line from a new angle, or a shard that refuses to be natural, no matter how much silt clings to it. When coasts retreated and harbors went dark, memory learned to walk inland, attaching itself to ritual and rhythm, so that knowledge could bloom wherever people gathered to mark the turning year. And schools formed that taught without ink, storing sequences inside breath and step, embedding calendars in procession routes, and turning courtyards into a basie where the sun counted for them, a library stitched into the body so it could travel lightly. In those precincts, the slow dance of the heavens became a daily practice, with the procession of the equinox taught as a patient migration along the edge of a wall, and eclipses rehearsed as a choreography of shadow, an education that encouraged a humility before time's larger cycles, even as it trained a keen eye to catch their subtle signatures, an ethic of proportion folded into geometry and song. Philosophers drank from these wells and carried the taste into their pages, writing of ideal polities and citizen virtues with the cadence of a builder counting courses and a surveyor measuring baselines, their famous dialogues quietly indebted to an older cult of measure that balanced ambition with limit, so that even when they spoke of a glittering island gone wrong, the axe they sharpened was ethical, not merely sensational. Across oceans and empires, other traditions preserve the tale of visitors from the shore, teaching order to chaos after flood, figures cloaked in the authority of patience who offered techniques rather than dogma, teaching how to terrace hills and read solstices and calms, and whether these are memories of diffusion or parallel invention shaped by similar needs, they point to a constant. After shock, communities crave rhythm, and some travelers were prepared to give it. When stones raise similar questions in far-flung fields, it is tempting to name a single ancestor and fetch origin stories from beneath the waves to explain correspondences. Yet parallel study under the same sky can produce similar answers, and trade can carry seed ideas without founding myths, so that what looks like a signature may be a convergence, and what appears as lineage may be kinship formed by listening to the same teachers dressed in light and shadow. On muddy estuaries in the Old West, excavations turn up amphorae and ingots in places where rivers braided into sea, and texts murmur of a people who mastered marsh and nettle until history misplaced their capital, an erasure that made later readers hungry for matches with famous losses. But whether or not they are the ones the philosopher alluded to, their ghost shows the fragility of coastal knowledge and the stubbornness of river-borne memory. As centuries slid, a body of writings rose that described a world stitched by sympathetic bonds, patterns echoing between above and below, a worldview that made architecture a participant in the cosmic conversation rather than a mere shelter, encoding correspondences into arch and aisle. And even when such texts were scorned later, their instincts survive where the spaces they informed still generate calm like a spring. Under domes and in cloisters, artisans guarded the craft of ratio through wars and famines, wrapping it in ornament so that it could hide in plain sight, embedding series in tile and proportion in window, teaching through beauty, what might otherwise have needed a formal teacher. And this quiet persistence looks like a lineage that did not care about names as much as it cared, keeping a certain harmony alive. Sometimes the past flashes in an object so complex it alters timelines. A corroded clock from a shipwreck that upon patient restoration proves able to predict celestial motions with a grace unseen again for a millennium, forcing us to imagine workshops that had distilled sky into gear and tooth, craft traditions that could not have stayed singular, a competence that must have had cousins we have not yet coaxed back into air. Elsewhere, ancient chambers reward precise attention with performances. A shaft of midwinter sun that creeps along a wall to kiss a spiral at noon. A whisper that magnifies under a dome into a blanket for the nervous system. A floor plan that carries numbers beloved by mathematicians who had yet to exist. An anthology of techniques that suggests a coherent intent. To bind mind to cycle and community to scale without coercion. The rooms where such knowledge was compared and refined earned more than once. Libraries that balanced scrolls on shelves under perfume and dust. Parchments carried out by arms too few to save them all. Catalogs lost where they stood, and each time the blaze took names and indices. But not the ratios already living in nave and alley and garden. Those pieces too distributed to burn without the whole world catching. So memory became tidal, swelling with peace and resources, then thinning with conflict and drought, leaving behind a residue of method that never fully vanished, a basal layer of practice upon which new styles and doctrines could be built, often without acknowledging the foundation's age. A forgetfulness, not malicious but habitual, because once a tool becomes obvious, it ceases to feel like an invention needing gratitude. In that sense, the legend becomes less an accusation about a specific hubris, and more an admonition about forgetting the cadence that keeps ambition from overreaching. A guide to a poised relationship with environment that makes prosperity robust rather than brittle. And when the myth's rings glow in the mind, they can be read as concentric disciplines at tension, measure, ceremony, ethics, each, protecting the next from tides. As the modern world hums with its own enthrallments, the quiet programs of attention that once defined wise building rise again as if they had been, patiently waiting for our eyes to adjust, and their survival across so many changes suggests they are not ornaments from a vanished age, but evergreen capacities. Seeds ready to sprout whenever people recall that stone and light and sound can be allies, not just materials. This rediscovery does not require a submarine to succeed, because it plays out in courtyards and on hilltops and under windows at dawn, where anyone can witness the planet teaching by example, and in that witnessing lies the next stage of the search, which is not so much to prove a thesis as to become again the kind of culture that could have written such a thesis in the first place. Modern instruments let us hear the planet's low drum, a suite of resonances that hum between earth and sky like invisible tides of tone, and the fact that such rhythms exist makes old fascinations with shape and orientation feel less decorative and more experimental, as if placing stone in water in particular relationships was a way to join the choir rather than to conduct it, a partnership more than an assertion. In quiet tests, microphones and spectrum analyzers confirm what bodies already know, that certain proportions make rooms gentle, that a low sustained tone in a chamber of particular volume softens breath and heart, and that niches and domes can blend voices into a single ribbon, the kind of evidence that reframes ceremony as a skillful manipulation of physics in the service of well-being, a kind of applied compassion inscribed in limestone. Site selection begins to look like a science of sensitivity when old alignments overlay modern maps of faults and aquifers, with tendencies that argue for more than coincidence. Even as caution insists that dry height and commanding views mattered too. Yet the aggregate suggests that builders once had ways to feel or infer qualities we now instrument, implying a methodology of attention that still fits if we attend. Stones themselves can whisper when stressed, crystals shuffling tiny charges that instruments can translate into voltages, and research into how shapes concentrate fields, however subtle those effects may be, unrolls a palette of physical behaviors that gives old obsessions new context, not to claim power where none exists, but to see that curiosity about form's interaction with environment was a rational part of early science as much as it was a ritual art. Weather and climate continue their slow dances with occasional lunges, and calendars that breathe, that allow slack for variations, and bake resilience into habit, feel wise again, suggesting that the most valuable inheritance from any legendary seafaring mind would be a deep comfort with cycles, and an instinct for adjusting before adjustment is demanded, a competence that makes communities supple rather than brittle when the wind turns. The ethical core remains intact through all of this, because the temptation to stretch knowledge beyond its proper proportion is perennial, and the story of a brilliant city losing its ear for harmony sounds less like a myth and more like a case study that repeats. A reminder that equations and instruments belong inside a larger geometry of behavior that checks scale against consequence before sea or fire does it for us. In coastal cities now, planners go back to first principles that would not surprise an old surveyor. Find breezes, court shade, turn streets to sun in winter and away from it in summer. Carve courtyards to make cool lungs in heat, and set foundations in dialogue with water rather than in defiance of it. I return to attention that feels like a fresh discovery, but is really an old song remembered on a different instrument. Offshore, machines glide in darkness, mapping with pings and lasers, returning each season with a finer portrait of the floor, and their work has the same patient cadence as the builders we imagine. Lay a course, mark a line, return with better tools, accept the water's edits, repeat, an attitude in which the romance of sudden revelation gives way to the deeper romance of craft, the love of steady, iterative seeing. The idea of Atlantis settles into this rhythm, not as a lost capital to be planted on a grid, but as a shorthand for a braid of practices that connect mind to pattern and pattern to place. A braid strong enough to have survived many storms by fraying into strands that can be rewoven wherever someone cares to tie them together again, which might be the most durable technology of all. From this vantage, a simple act becomes a continuation of the search. Stand at dawn in a room set to greet the sun, and watch the warmth find the mark on the wall. Hum a sustained note, and feel whether the air blooms. Step a courtyard's length and taste its ratio. Mark the shadow at noon, and compare it tomorrow. A quiet apprenticeship to a planet that has been teaching since the first horizon broke the first light. The horizon refuses to deliver closure, just as it always has, and in that refusal lies the true companionship of this mystery. Because as long as a question remains a little larger than the latest answer, curiosity has room to breathe, and where curiosity breathes, attention thrives. And where attention thrives, the scattered old signatures begin to gather into meaning again, even if they never coalesce into a single name. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.